I've been asked to talk about Reconciliation Week as it's coming up 27 May to 3 June. I want to start by reflecting on what Reconciliation Week means to me. On 13 February 2008, Kevin Rudd made what we know as a sorry speech. I want to quote part of that speech. We today take this first step by acknowledging the past and laying claim to a future that embraces all Australians, a future where this Parliament resolves that the injustices of the past must never, never happen again. And as a non-Aboriginal Australian, I remember feeling enormous happiness that that speech was made and felt it was long overdue. I was horrified by what I knew of Aboriginal history and was thankful that it was historic. But I'm really embarrassed to admit that I really did think of the impact of colonisation and the stolen generations as something relegated to the history books. Then I started working more closely with Aboriginal people when I was employed in a role working with incarcerated Aboriginal men and women on post-release employment programs. I heard the stories of hundreds of Aboriginal men and women in that role, and it was then that I realised that the impact of these events was not historic at all. I heard so many stories of little children taken off the streets and removed from their families during the stolen generation, put into white institutions where they were sexually and physically abused and treated as disposable. When I put myself in their shoes for a moment, I realised I would never have been able to grow into a functioning human being, completely disconnected from my family and support structures, let alone my culture and country, scared, abused, told that this was for my own good. And the people doing this to me, taking the moral high ground, I could understand as I started to just contemplate that, how people could turn to substances to cope, and I never had to live it for a moment. And sadly, when I was listening to those stories, I realised that the impact created trauma that is not easily healed. And I ended up listening to the stories of so many Aboriginal men and women who had suffered directly as a result of these policies. I had had no idea of the concept of transgenerational trauma and the fact that this is directly linked to the impact of colonisation. I didn't understand the notion that trauma begets violence, begets trauma, begets violence, and that this impact is replicated across all colonised people across the world. We have a short video to share on this.
The story of our communities, people and nation starts a long, long time ago. More than 60,000 years, in fact. This was when our culture and our law first started to thrive. We knew who we were and where we belonged. We took care of each other, our land and our waters. We ate food that made us healthy, lived on country and abided by our laws and song lines. Our families, our children were happy, with strong minds and hearts, because they were where they belonged. But then, everything changed.
Colonization came, bringing wars, disease, famine, violence, and the destruction and violation of our cultural laws, sacred sites, families, and communities.
We were denied our knowledge, language, ceremonies, and identity, the very things that tell us who we are and where we belong. And our connections with each other and the land grew weak.
And then our children were taken from us. They had their names changed and their identities stripped away. They were told that Aboriginal people were bad. Worse still, they were told that their parents and grandparents did not want them.
For years this happened, and those children became known as the stolen generations.
Our children were denied love and experienced physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. This left very deep, very complex, and very real wounds, leaving scars that are still being felt personally, socially, spiritually, and collectively.
In the time when our story started, we were able to parent in the cultural way that has seen our families survive and thrive for generations. Our people were strong, and our culture flowed and healed us in times of hurt.
But since the trauma of colonisation and the stolen generations, we have not been able to heal in the same way. And we have unknowingly passed this trauma on to our children through sharing our sad stories and having them witness and experience our pain. This is known as intergenerational trauma, and we see symptoms today in broken relationships, disconnected families, violence, suicide, and drug and alcohol abuse.
But this is not where our story ends. We still have strong minds and hearts, and we still know who we were and where we belong. By creating safe and strong communities together, supporting our families to be free from pain, returning to our culture and building a strength of identity, we can stop the cycle of trauma and bring about positive intergenerational change so that we can continue to thrive for the next 60,000 years. There are simple things that we can all do to help heal our trauma.
Visit healingfoundation.org.au to find out more.
I had no idea that the impact of these historic events was still reverberating today, and I feel deeply embarrassed at how naive I was to that. And I know that not all Aboriginal people experience this trauma in the same ways, but I heard enough stories to know that it was still relevant and still a major injustice that had not been in any way undone by any well-meaning policymaker. Kevin Rudd's speech continued, a future where we harness the determination of all Australians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to close the gap that lies between us in life expectancy, educational achievement and economic opportunity. We have closed the gap targets and we fall depressingly short on most of those, but we think of them in terms of numbers. How often do we stop and reflect on this? Because I know I rarely gave it thought. Let's think about just one target we are not meeting, infant mortality. 141 Aboriginal children per 100,000 compared with 67 per 100,000 for non-Indigenous people. We're not even trying to close this gap, we're trying to halve it. Our aim was 94 per 100,000. Firstly, why isn't our aim 67? But secondly, talk to anyone who has lost a child and you will know that the impact of this is catastrophic. But so often we think of it in terms of numbers and we don't consider the huge number of people whose lives are shattered through these kinds of numbers. And that's before we even get to reduce life expectancy or suicide rates. We don't have anywhere near the urgency that reflects that we genuinely understand the impact of such high numbers for an already traumatised community. I used to think of racism as an equally historic concept, but I'll show you this photo of 3 kids in my life. One of them was waiting early one morning for the school bus and had 2 women talking loudly about why the Aboriginal boy was loitering around. They decided he was probably up to no good, like most of these Aboriginal kids, and carried on their walk as if it was nothing. They didn't consider the profound impact their words had on a kid just waiting to go to school. Another one was walking their dog and had police stop and frisk them in the street for drugs on a 14-year-old with no adult present. Another one has been told at school that they should be a kid's slave because that's all black people are. And you've never seen security hypervigilance in your life like you do when you watch these 3 walk into a store together. You hear security announcements on the PA, you watch security guards keep an eagle eye on them, you watch workers follow them down the aisles. These 3 are some of the nicest kids you will meet. A bit biased because one is mine, although she's not Aboriginal, but yet they experience this on a regular basis. For me, Reconciliation Week is an opportunity for us to reflect on these realities more deeply. It's a time for me to acknowledge that the impact of historic policies reverberates within the Aboriginal community today. The impact didn't stop when the policy did, and that racism is still a thing. But importantly for me, it's about saying, what can I do about it? All of us are in a prime position to change this reality. We work in early childhood and school spaces, we work with policymakers, we work alongside Aboriginal people, we work with Aboriginal community members in our roles. Reconciliation Week for me provides me with the catalyst to say, what can I change in the way I do my job that can truly honour the words of the national apology to close the gap that lies between us? And I challenge every one of us to do the same, but more of that shortly. Now, getting back to that challenge, as a Wimmera champion, I'm really honoured to be able to test an improvement approach with the staff in the Horsham office, at least once we get back there. And I'm happy for anyone in the other offices to speak with me later about doing the same there if you're interested. I've worked with some of the staff in the Horsham office to develop a logic model of what we want to achieve, aligned with both the Wimmera Inclusion Plan and Morong Aboriginal Education Plan. This is a logic model. The focus looks both internally and externally. The inputs are important because none of this will work if we are not using the existing frameworks, but most importantly, the Aboriginal community. This will never work if this is us as non-Aboriginal people coming up with ideas on what we can do without listening to what the Aboriginal community want from us. The strategies are high-level strategies that allow us to test a whole lot of change ideas about changing our practice in response to our conversations with the Aboriginal community. The short-term outcomes are also divided internally and externally. We want to make sure our workplace is culturally safe for our Aboriginal colleagues, but also for any Aboriginal person who comes into our office. We also want our daily work to benefit all Aboriginal people. And you will see that this leads to the long-term outcomes that align directly with the Marung Aboriginal Education Plan. The idea is that we'll come up with changes in practice that we can try. An improvement approach works best when those changes in practice are small. So it might be something like being intentional and engaging differently with a single Aboriginal family or student that had previously disengaged. It might be attempting to create a strong, equitable partnership with an Aboriginal family and thinking really deeply about what that means. It may be ensuring an acknowledgement of country is incorporated into all our meetings. It may be promoting the embedding of Aboriginal culture into schools or early childhood services. There are so many things we could change in our practice that are very small and can be implemented next week at no cost to ourselves, but by being intentional about these small changes, the cumulative effect can be massive. In practice, this will involve us spending a few minutes once a month discussing a change in practice we intend to make over the next month. Then the next month, we'll come back and discuss what we learned and what we could do differently this time around to improve that practice. We will look to each other for suggestions of what can work better for us in our roles. We will be open to learning and to not always getting it right. But most importantly, we will seek the advice and guidance of our Aboriginal colleagues and community members. We will ask what we can do better, and we will listen to the answers openly in the spirit of constant improvement. At the end of a 12-month period, we will be able to reflect on our impact for the Aboriginal people in our community, but also on the cultural safety of our own workplace. I'm really proud to be in a department that has an inclusion plan that supports this, although I'd be infinitely more proud if there wasn't a need for one. And I look forward to hearing what we can achieve even in the midst of these chaotic times. And I would love Reconciliation Week to be the catalyst we all need to start thinking differently, because we are all in it together. Thank you.